Hello, welcome to episode 54 of the One Life podcast. We talk about things from One Life Church, but ultimately things we think relate to you and your one and only life. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sarah Inman, and we are starting our first week coming out of our Centered series. We had our first Sunday of that this past Sunday. If you didn't have a chance to watch or listen to that message, you can go to the One Life app or onelifechurch.org, hit messages. You can find that information there and see the content that we've created. We have a couple things that we're hoping to do through the podcast, as that's one of the things we've asked people to do during the next 7 weeks is to listen to the podcast, because there's 3 things we would like to do here. We want to build a Christ-centered worldview. That's what we're hoping the whole idea of our Centered series does. Build confidence about our Christ-centered worldview. Be able to have confidence as you're learning and seeking and getting an understanding. And then ultimately the podcast, what we're hoping to do is to learn how to have conversations about that Christ-centered worldview. And today we have Zach Bilo on the podcast. We're going to be talking to him here in a few minutes about that and some of the things that he's been studying and learning and how he's continuing to use that information to help us talk and have conversations. But I'm joined today, as always, by our co-host and lead pastor, Brett Nicholson. And Brett has some stuff that he'd love to kind of start each of the podcast for the next 7 weeks, some information about. So Brett, it's all you.
All right. Well, thank you. Anyone who did take us up on this, if you've never listened to the podcast before, hopefully you'll go back and want to listen to them in the past. We've had a lot of very interesting guests from around our city, and so I encourage you to continue to track with it. But we did ask everybody to do it for the purpose of conversation. So I'm going to frame up the next several weeks that we have going, and our primary passage that we're going to look at, we quoted on Sunday, it's 1 Peter chapter 3, and it says this: "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." So always be prepared. Somebody asks you, why do you believe this stuff? Why do you go to church? Why do you worship? Why does any of that matter? You're supposed to be prepared to be able to give a halfway good answer. So one of the things that we're going to do over the next several weeks is we are going to talk about how to prepare answers. That'll be in podcast in the future. But then, even possibly more importantly, he goes on to say, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience. He gives the manner in which you're supposed to give the answers, and that's where we're going to really start today. We're going to talk about the manner, because we all know, we've all lived in it. We've been on social media where people kind of rage against one another. They talk in social media kind of like they do in traffic, where it's like they act like these people aren't really hearing them, but they do. And we all know that's a problem in our society. But how do you talk to people who are of different worldviews and who do have different beliefs? Because beliefs are very dear to people. People take them very seriously. And so anger can be kind of on the premium. And so what we're going to hopefully learn over the next several weeks is how to deliver these things. I've had a little bit of experience in this, because just being a pastor, I've talked to a lot of people about their beliefs. It kind of comes with the territory. People ask me questions they may not ask other people. And so I like to think I've learned a few ways to apply this scripture. And so that's what we're going to do. And today, the reason we have Zach here is his passion has been, he's writing his thesis on living in a secular age. And notice that Peter said, but do this with gentleness and respect. And I really want to zero in on that word respect, because at the core of respect is listening. It's not all about talking. When you want to share your beliefs, or you want to find out or discuss about someone else's beliefs, you want to think respect, and respect comes with listening and being curious about what other people think. And so, again, Zach's passion is living in a secular age. Well, guess what? We all live in a secular age. We do. And I define secular as really just self-rule. It's not necessarily not believing in God. It's just kind of, just thinking in terms of God's not really directly applicable to my life. I'm doing my own thing, going my own way. So, but we all live in that age. And there's a lot of things about it that I think Zach will help us understand that person that we're sitting across the table from, that we're having coffee with, and that we're talking about beliefs. And so that's really what we're going to do, as we kind of explore, what does it mean to talk to people who do have a secular outlook or a worldview that's kind of more of that American secularism.
Awesome. And there are a few things that Brett has asked everyone to do during this series, and one of them is to listen to the podcast. So if you're listening right now, great job. You're already starting off really well. Another is to join a growth group. If you've never been a part of a growth group, or maybe you're not in one currently, you can go to the One Life app, hit the Centered button at the very top of the app. It has all this information of the things that we're asking you to do and be a part of, and ultimately for those three purposes that we mentioned earlier. And you can join a growth group. There's some that are happening at each One Life campus. So maybe you're not really comfortable going to someone's house. You can come to one of the campuses and find a group that fits for you for the next 7 weeks to discuss some of this content. And to highlight, the content you'll be going through was written by Zach.
Oh, man.
I just put a lot of pressure on.
That's right. Zach everywhere. That's right. Yeah, that's right. He's
Zach
the one that wrote the content.
is writing the content, and I feel like our content game is going way up.
It is. That's right.
I used to try to write notes from other people just talking in a room, and it was crazy. And now Zach takes it and makes it great. But the other couple things was to attend every week, which you have 6 more weeks to attend. So if you attended last week, great job. And so we just are looking for ways to continue connecting, and also through our daily Bible readings. Those are also on the app. You can stay connected through the daily Bible readings as we're going through that together as a church. And so I just want to introduce Zach as we go here and you get to have some conversation with Zach. So Zach is on staff here at One Life Church, and he is finishing up his master's in philosophy and apologetics. And as Brett said, he's writing and finishing his thesis on living in a secular age. It's a big topic.
Yeah, it is, I guess. It's been studying a Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, and he wrote a giant manifesto called A Secular Age that has helped me just really think through all of that and given me a pretty good framework for it. I think it feels true to me, at least.
And I think as you were talking, Brett, as you're reading the scripture, and I was thinking about one of the things that you have to do is you have to research and ask questions and be kind of inquisitive about people. And we said that we all live in the same environment, and we would call that a secular society, kind of this cultural moment that we're in. But if we are all living in that, what does that mean? From the research that you've done, as we kind of set up a little bit of a conversation, what's kind of the background on that?
So a lot of times when you talk about secularism, it's just like this. You hear just the stats of belief is declining, but the way that Charles Taylor approaches it, the guy that I'm writing a thesis about, is that what it feels like to live in a secular age. And a lot of what he talks about is sort of uncovering the background of that. So the kind of default assumptions of society, that we don't start in neutral. We all come to the table of our beliefs with all this other stuff. And David Foster Wallace told a great story that kind of helps flesh this out a little bit. It's a silly little story, but he said that, I think he did in a speech, he said that there were 2 fish swimming in the ocean, and they're swimming along, and an old elder fish swims by them, and as they pass, the old elder fish says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they just kind of swim on, and a little bit down the way, one of the young fish turns to the other and says, "What in the world is water?" And so it's just this idea that the background is the stuff we're swimming in that we don't have any idea we're even swimming in it unless we actually really work hard to kind of uncover what that is. And so a secular age or secular time culture that we're living in now, to me, is a time when the background, the default assumption, has switched from a place where God was sort of the given and we worked from there to a place where that's no longer the case. We're not starting with a background of God, if that makes sense.
And our vision is changing the secular worldview of the next generation. And I think we've talked about this a little bit. And if you take that information and saying that the next generation is being born in a time that would be considered a secular cultural moment, for them, it's not anything different. That's just what they know. Would I be assuming that correctly?
Yeah, I think you are so far. That's right. But that's important to know, because sometimes as believers, we can kind of jump the gun on just kind of hitting people with Bible verses or something like that, when just by virtue of being born here in the United States and watching TV and being a part of the culture and going to school, the assumptions are different. They don't automatically think that the Bible is any more important than any other book there is. And it's not, sometimes it's not because they're actively unbelieving. It's just they automatically think that science or something like that is going to be more trustworthy, or it's really kind of the foundation. Whereas even 50 years ago, or certainly a couple hundred years ago, it was just the opposite. People automatically thought, oh yeah, God of course is there, and it was a little bit different conversation. And that's very, very important to understand as we seek to respect people and understand them and listen to them.
Yeah, I think even even I'm 38 now, and so when I was growing up, it was sort of like you were a good, ethical contributor of society if you were a Christian. It was kind of the thing to be. You're a good guy if you're a Christian. Christians had the moral high ground. Now it's switched, and it's no longer that. Christians are more the ones that are we're viewed as morally wrong on issues that at one time we were viewed as morally right about.
Yeah.
And at one time when it was, I don't want to say beneficial, but I mean that's sort of what beneficial to be a Christian. Now it is no longer beneficial.
Yeah, when I heard one scholar say that it's the first time in American history where it wasn't socially advantageous to be a good church-going person. That has changed, and this is the first generation that happened to. Because even people that weren't necessarily true Christ-following Christians, if you were a good church-going person and identified with that was socially advantageous to you. No longer true. Mm-hmm. So, and sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that we're just having a very, very different conversation. And Zach, before we started this, we were talking about just some of the markers of that water that we're swimming in. What are some of those things that we kind of all think, but especially those who are not Christ-centered and those who are far from God in our lives? What are some of those automatic thoughts that they have?
So one of the thoughts is just the understanding. It's the question of how we know things, I guess. How do we know things are true? And it's sort of this the scientific stance, I guess, that there has to always be certainty, evidence, we're objective, where just all the overly rational, everything can be explained by us. I think that is one. If you were at church Sunday, Brett showed a clip of young Sheldon, and it's sort of the young Sheldon approach to the way we know things. That's in the underlying background. But at the same time, we're living in tension of that, kind of understanding that may not be the case, sort of, at the same time.
Yeah, so everybody has this default, I believe in science. That's how we know things. Obviously, science does extraordinary things, from our phones to rockets to everything else. So we have this built-in respect that all of us have. And it better be almost proven by science in the back of our minds. Now, is that right? I mean,
I think so. So, when you talk about the background, I just use the example, and I heard Natalie, our executive director, say the same thing, that sometimes when we're talking with non-Christian friends, they always use the phrase like, what about science? But they don't have any follow-up from there. It's sort of like just this, like you said, it's the foundation is what about science, but there's no, if you press them and say, well, what do you mean? There's not really a next thing. It's just that the background says this is the starting point. You have to have me figure out how to get past this kind of thing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so, because if we're talking about a religious thing, I'm gonna push it away by saying, well, the way we know things is through science, and so what about that? And they may not even have specific examples. I remember, I think we brought it up on the podcast before. We've done Kickstart questions, which are Kickstart group experience where people can come and they can ask whatever they want. And one of the questions was, why do we quote scientific data and surveys and all that kind of thing? And that's honestly why I do it. It's not because I think it's superior to the Bible. I just know that most of us, and even Christ-following people, we, without even realizing with what I hear you saying, we're swimming around the water where we all assume if there's a scientific fact you can give along with it to bolster a thing in the Bible, you're going to be more likely to believe it just as a 21st century person. You just are. You can't help it. I'm that way. I mean, I kind of look for things, but that is how people think. And that's one of the things we need to know about that person sitting across the table from us, that they view science as a true sense, a true source, rather, of authority.
Yeah.
What are some of those other things?
I think one of the big ones that I sense really strongly too is the idea that we live in this cross pressure of belief and unbelief. Coming out of a time when certainty was kind of like, again, certainty was the background. I think about when I was growing up again, even 30, 40 years ago, doubts. You didn't talk about doubts. You didn't talk about questions. Everything was pretty much a given. There was certainty, and that's, again, out of that scientific stance. But now, Charles Taylor talks about we live in an age where we are constantly cross-pressured by belief and unbelief at the same time. And that shows up in the form of a lot of different things.
So there's like this irony going on in us, but we're default is science. It's the only way we can know. But are you saying that kind of like, in a way, we all know you don't know a lot of things? And so
I think we're
struggling with
I think
this.
we're getting there finally. Yeah, like we are coming out of the hangover of that, I guess. Like we're starting to see, well, maybe we don't know it. Maybe we can't prove everything, you know? It's this sense of, it makes sense to me that for thousands of years we believed one way. The last 200, we've all of a sudden thought that we could explain the world in a totally different, better way. Maybe that's not actually true. You know, I think that's the tension that we're kind of uncovering now.
Yeah, it's like we instinctively know you can't put everything under a microscope. You can't put everything in a laboratory, but we don't know what that is. So what he's saying is everybody, and again, this is all of us. This is the person sitting across from you. That in some ways, all of us are there. I know I am. That there's a tension there of what you can so-called prove scientifically, and this other part of life that you can't quite nail down. And everybody's dealing with that angst.
Yeah,
and even having that answer, like when someone asks you a question and you say that you know the answer, or oh yeah, I believe that, but you don't quite understand what you're saying. It's even like you're just in it and you assume that everyone believes that as well. And I think something that you guys had said earlier that made me think of it even as someone with a Christ-centered worldview, that sometimes even we get stuck in that to where we don't believe that anyone else has a different one. And how can we have a conversation? And so I think what we're trying to do here is just setting up a base of saying, like, these are some things that culturally people believe. And so you talked about science and cross pressure. One we had talked about earlier is people kind of creating their own meaning of what that would be. And that's, I think there's a word for that, a title for that.
Maybe expressive individualism is how it would be described, but that's sort of the place where we find ourselves now. Over the last few hundred years, we have kind of evolved self into a place where now we are the creators of meaning. We are no longer communitarian. We are individuals just in each other's space. We can create our own knowledge. We can create our own meaning. All this stuff. It's just based around we manufacture our life kind of thing. That's one of the.
Is part of that. This is for either one of you guys. Do you think of the way that we get information now as part of that, from that we can get so much of it so quickly that we think we have all the information? I don't know.
Yeah, on the individual thing, I think I can, and they say more and more. I know my brother-in-law, he's an award-winning teacher and everything. He says he's getting the question more and more all the time, why do I need to know this? Why do I even need to go to school? Because I can look up anything. I can get to it. I have information right in my hand. And he's having a hard time coming up with the answer. Like, yes, you need universal knowledge. You need things beyond what you can Google. But a lot of people, they say Google searches are showing things like, what's the purpose of life? What people are asking Siri these things. And so that, I can get to that because that goes back to the science thing. It goes back to everything else.
So one way that's described is the cross pressure between what he calls the buffered self and the porous self. So if you think of buffered self, it's closed off. Nothing can penetrate it. So you are sort of in your own bubble of creating your own life, versus the tension that we live in of also the porous self, that there are things that, if you think of something that's porous, a sponge, it can absorb stuff, so that we can. So it's a tension of the buffered, closed off from all other outside forces, with the porous self that can absorb and be affected by things outside of it.
So the modern age is pretty much we're all just a ball of contradictions, right? That's
I think
hearing.
So.
I living in tensions and pressures and buffers.
If he's at least if he's right at all, it's basically us. And I don't necessarily want to jump ahead, but it's basically us coming to terms with what we see as the failure of all the things that this secularization promised. That we were going to, if we just closed off all outside forces and we just created our own meaning and we just lived as individuals and we manufactured ourselves, then we were and we pushed away anything transcendent, anything God, anything spiritual, anything mysterious, that we would all be happier, healthier, blissful people, and we're starting to see that that's just not true. There's more people on medication than ever, prescription medication for depression, anxiety, all that stuff. There's suicides are at an all-time high. Every study kind of shows that we're less and less happy. If you are on social media, or you see that we are much more fragile and fractured than ever before. And so we're living in this time when we're starting to process the failure of the promises of secularity. And so we're now caught in the tension of living in that, if that makes any sense. We're feeling it, we're sensing it. And so we have this background that has been one thing, and I think it's changing to something else as we're living in this tension. It's going to get played out, kind of thing.
Yeah. And as you say that, though, I start getting hopeful in a sense, because it does, and even the individualism thing, I think as you say that, I'm hearing more and more in the cultural conversation how people are longing for community. We know we're intensely, terribly individualistic, but it's almost like everybody's recognizing, I don't want to be that, and I want to get in the community. And it's interesting that all those answers are found within, in the New Testament. Isn't it interesting that it includes community as a fundamental part of the reality that you're supposed to have, and that's one of the things we're offering.
Yeah. So when we're talking about having conversations with people, and we can bring out that tension, and we can bring out the how this whole idea of us creating life in isolation and we're going to be happier, we can actually talk about how the vision of life that Jesus had actually was very communitarian. It was very that we need each other. We're, the fullest life is lived when we are in relation with one another, that we don't just create ourselves and then buffer everybody else away. But Jesus' vision for life is that we are in relation with one another. And that's a place where Jesus' vision for life is better than the secular story's vision for life.
And when we relate that back to having conversations and getting to understand people, because I'm loving this so much, my brain's kind of opening up to some things. I'm like, I don't think I've thought about that. So hopefully you guys are too as you're listening. But I would say that for me, I'm probably not going to go up to someone, and I don't think you're saying this at all, but just want to highlight it. I'm not going to go up and be like, hey, you are having a really bad time in life because you're believing in this, right? That's not the way that I'm going to jump into someone's life, right? If I don't have a relationship.
Probably not,
yeah. But what I would do is being able to come in and say, my hope and joy, that I have for me comes from this, and be able to explain that, which is a lot of what the message the scripture you read as we started out here as well. And so as we understand some of these things, or kind of put them in our base of knowledge and kind of start from there, how does this help us have conversations? What's something that either one of you have using this information? How do we better understand people, or what's one practical step when we're having conversations?
Well, for me, it's first of all, it is an awareness, and you get that from listening. And I guess I would sum it up like being aware that we're all in the modern age. Number one, science is an authority, and that's not something you can criticize out of someone. It just is. It's just because it's how we've all been raised. We all think that way, even more than we probably think we do. Going back to your water example, like what is water? Well, you probably believe in science a lot more than you think you do. So just being aware of that. And when someone asks, what about science? They're not asking a pushback question necessarily. They're asking something that's going to naturally come out, and you ought to be prepared to respond to that. Always be prepared to give an answer. Well, just ask them about that. What do you mean by that exactly? And ask another question. And then the individualism thing, it's the same way. And you can talk out of your sense of having found relationships and love and those kinds of things in the modern world. Those are a couple things that strike me, just portraying that communal sense that you do have, and that God is a relationship God, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think another helpful thing of just understanding the cross pressure that everyone feels, it can give us a little more confidence, because I don't know, we create a caricature of people that don't follow Jesus sometimes as militant atheists or something like that, and the vast majority of people are not that. They are living in this tension of belief and unbelief, of sort of like the haunting of transcendence and the flattening of the world, all those things. They're living in tension, as you and I are. We just our tension might be held in a different way, stronger towards Christ-centered belief. So that can give us confidence because, we're not having to talk to militant atheists that are going to, belittle all of our beliefs. They're probably going to be open to conversations, I would think. So.
And if that's kind of where people are living, kind of in that middle section a lot, I would say, or even as you're saying, like they're one side or the other, what do you think is the biggest barrier for change? Like from that, for using a scale, which we have one around here somewhere actually, going from one side to the other, like what's one of the biggest barriers? It doesn't have to be the biggest because that's a lot of pressure.
Do you want to go first? Want me to?
You're the master's degree guy. I was waiting on that. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you the answer with the story. Actually a research experiment that happened a few years ago. I think it was University of Virginia, and what they did is they brought in individuals, and one at a time they had them go in and sit in a room. It was a room of low stimuli, so there was just white walls. There was no pictures on the wall, no clock on the wall, nothing but a room and a chair. And they told them just sit here for 20 minutes and think about just enjoy your brain kind of thing, contemplate, self-reflect, that kind of stuff. And so you could do that, or there was the big twist there was in the room next to the chair a button you could push that it would give you stimulation through a painful electric shock. And so I appreciate that they made everybody do it first, just to eliminate the possibility of curiosity, because I might have pushed the button just out of curiosity.
See what it does. Who wouldn't?
So they made everybody do it first, right. And after they did it, everyone said that they never wanted that to happen again, and they even asked them a question of, would you pay money to not get shocked again? And they all answered yes. So the experiment ensues, and people just sit there. All I have to do is sit there and not fall asleep and not get out of the chair. And it was shocking. The women were much smarter than the men. The women, 25% of them decided to push the button and receive electric shock instead of sit there for 20 minutes. But 75% of men pushed the button. And so what that study showed is that we have a really hard time being with ourselves and reflecting and just thinking, in an information economy, which is what we have, what you talked about, everything that you want, you can be distracted with, endless amounts of information. We never process anything. And so, which is again, just such a beautiful thing about the gospel, about Jesus, about all the spiritual masters that have come before through the Christian faith, about just how important contemplation is. And I think that again is probably why we see fractured and fragile people, is because we're not contemplating actually who we are.
Wow.
And sometimes if we do, we might not like the answer that we get.
I think that's probably what we're scared of.
It's like, we're scared to get the answer, so we just keep pouring in more information. But it is, I like what you said about, we can be confident because people are wrestling with these things internally, and if we can get them to slow down enough, and again, through asking questions, through gentleness, through respect, just kind of fleshing out, if they ask about science, what do you mean by that? What's some of your perspectives on that, and how do you think that the Christian faith maybe goes against that? And a lot of people probably wouldn't be able to know. They would be like, well, and we're going to talk in future podcasts about evidence that you can offer, even some scientific things that you can back up belief. A lot of people have wrong ideas about how the New Testament was put together, and you can have simple answers to that kind of thing in there. But yeah, trying to get people to contemplate a meaning beyond that without being scared half to death is a little bit more of a challenge. But we'll talk some more about those things as we go and travel through these.
Yeah, I think the other thing that people could and should just do, and this is why we're doing the Worldview series, is that we should learn what Jesus' vision of life was, so that we can compare it against the background and see where it's different, and see where it tells a better story than what the secular story tells us.
Exactly, yeah, because that picture of service, he came to not to be served, but to serve, and just the picture of life that he gives, and somehow moving that robes and sandals world into the modern world of technology, because everybody is aching for that, but they want meaning, and they want to see life that is communal, and everybody desires it. And believe it or not, as old as sometimes old-fashioned as the church can look at times, it really does. Its beauty is surfacing through all the very things that people are struggling with in a secular age.
Well, Guys, this has been terrific. And I think for me, I know it's definitely creating a solid foundation and base to kind of kick the rest of the series off. This is a great start. And hopefully, as you guys are listening, this is a great opportunity for you. We'd love to hear your feedback, anything that you want to add to or ask questions about. You can email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org, and we would love to have conversation with you as well. So, Zach, thank you so much for joining us and coming on and sharing some of your field of study and just some of the things you have. And Brett, anything that you want to point people towards for the next week?
Yeah, I just want to encourage everybody to stay tuned with the podcast, because we are going to continue to build this whole thing on conversations. We're going to do some very practical things about how to be prepared to give an answer. And the guests we're going to have, we've intentionally gone after people who came to Christ as adults, who were a very different worldview, and then made cross that bridge over into faith. What was life really like for them? What kinds of things impacted them? What didn't impact them? We're also going to have an apologist on that's going to talk about literal evidences, someone that does debate and does all those things. And so it'll be good stuff. And I think by the time you listen to all those things, you'll have a little bit better handle, and you will have a little bit more confidence talking to people.
Awesome. This has been super fun. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the One Life Podcast. If you heard anything that you want other people to know, we totally love it if you share that out on social media and let other people hear it as well. My name's Sarah, and I produced this episode, and our music was produced by Micah Robertson and Ben Brock. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you get an alert anytime there's a new episode. If you ever want to contact us at the podcast, you can email us at podcast@onelifechurch.org.